Welcome back to Inside the Vatican with America Media. I'm your host, Colleen Dulle, and I am so glad to be joined once again by our veteran Vatican correspondent, Gerard O'Connell. Good morning from New Orleans, Jerry.
Good evening from Rome, Colleen. It's good to be back after 4 weeks.
It's great to see you again.
I've been asked why I was absent, so let me summarize rapidly. We were in holiday in Patagonia in Argentina, and either a spider or an insect or some beastie infected me, and when I came back to Rome, I had a bad infection, severe infection in my right leg under the knee, and it has taken 4 weeks to overcome that.
Yeah, our listeners don't know that when we recorded our last episode with you around the time of the consistory, you were dealing with some pretty brutal pain. So we're very, very glad that you're feeling better now.
Thank you.
All right, Jerry, before we get into our main story, we have had some updates recently about Pope Leo's travel schedule. So the Holy See Press Office told us that the Pope will not visit the U.S. this calendar year. This was responding to questions from journalists because there had been some rumors. And then also Bishop Richard Umbers down in Australia announced that the Pope will visit Sydney for the International Eucharistic Congress in 2028. So I wanted to ask you briefly what these two trips and maybe the other forthcoming trips that we know about that we've talked about a little on the show recently, what they tell us about what Leo is prioritizing.
Well, 2028 is a long way down the road, Colleen.
Certainly.
So I'll put that on the side. It had been anticipated that the Pope may have gone to the United Nations for the opening of the General Assembly in September. And if he had gone to New York, it had been expected that he would probably have had to go to Washington and to Chicago. But of course, that was coming on the eve of the midterm elections, very important ones. And the Vatican, I think very wisely, decided that's not exactly the appropriate moment for Leo to go to the United States.
Right. This is pretty classic for the Vatican. They don't like to have popes visit countries in their election years.
Absolutely. And then what we do know is that after Easter, around the 11, 12, 13 April, the Pope will set out on a 4-country Africa trip. He will go to Algeria first, and then he will also visit Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, and Angola. Francis had anticipated going to Angola. Then in June, we know that around the 10th of June, for the anniversary of the birth of Gaudi, the architect of the Sagrada Familia, he will be in Barcelona. He will also visit Madrid, and he will go to the Canary Islands, again, something that Francis had wanted to do. And now we know that since he's not going to the States, to the UN in September, it seems very likely, and the Peruvian bishops are taking it almost for granted, that Leo will go to Peru, to Argentina, and to Uruguay. And that will be around the end of November, beginning of December. And of course, this is important also because in 2027, there will be elections in Argentina. So it would have been obviously not the time to go to Argentina. So the likelihood that he's going to travel to Latin America at the end of November, beginning of December is high. The Vatican, of course, is not confirming this. I think that will come some way down the line.
Yeah, I feel like often we get confirmations and official plans coming about 6 weeks before any trip. So it should be a while before we hear about that definitively. All right, Jerry. So this week on the show, we're very pleased to welcome John Thavis, friend of the show, longtime Rome Bureau Chief of Catholic News Service, and we're going to have a roundtable conversation together on the recent announcement that the Priestly Society of St. Pius X made, where they said they plan to ordain new bishops with or without Vatican approval. Welcome to Inside the Vatican, John.
Thank you, Colleen. It's a pleasure to join you both, especially on this rather perennial issue.
Yes, indeed. The reason that we've asked you here is that you wrote a wonderful chapter that remains relevant about the Society of St. Pius X in your book, The Vatican Diaries, which, of course, I will link to if our listeners would like to check it out. So let's get to today's news, and then we'll rewind a bit and talk about the history. So on February 2nd, the Traditionalist Society of St. Pius X, better known as SSPX, we'll probably call it that throughout this conversation, said it's going to ordain new bishops on July 1st with or without Vatican approval. Now, the SSPX was founded in 1970, and it's long been kind of a bastion of resistance to Vatican II. It's a traditionalist community. It focuses on priestly formation and devotion to the pre-Vatican II Latin Mass. Now, interestingly, its founder, the French Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, ordained bishops without Vatican approval back in 1988 in an effort to continue his work. Now, the current superior says that its requests for permission to ordain new bishops have been ignored by the Vatican, but they plan to do it anyway, which would lead to the excommunication both of the ordaining bishop and any bishop being ordained. So why would they do this? To understand this story, I think it's important to know the history of SSPX and its longstanding relationship negotiations with the Vatican. John, can you run us through that, maybe all the way through, I guess, the time that you retired around the end of the Benedict papacy?
I mean, to be honest, I remember back in the 1980s when I was covering this story and the continual back and forth, the provocation, the reaction, the debate going on, and thinking to myself, this story is never going to end. And here we are 35, 40 years later, and it's come around again. It's the same issues. It's basically the same story with different people being the protagonists. But it's stretched now over 5 pontificates, 50 years, and the same issues keep coming around and around. Back in 1970, Archbishop Lefebvre founded the SSPX, and he founded it as an organization that would try to preserve Catholic tradition from what he saw as rather dangerous reforms generated by the Second Vatican Council.
And Lefebvre was at Vatican II, right?
He was. He served in some capacity.
He was in the 120-member preparatory commission for Vatican II, put there by John the 23rd. And of course, when those documents were presented to the first session of the council, which had been prepared by this preparatory commission, they were thrown out. Even within his own order, he was kind of stood out as I don't know what you would call it, super traditionalist, or he didn't really want to change much in the church as it was then.
Got it. So what happens after Vatican II?
Well, for Archbishop Lefebvre, it was a nightmare. He was especially critical of liturgical reform, and in 1970, the new Mass was, in his view, imposed on the Church. But it wasn't the only issue. The liturgy was not the only issue. He and his followers really rejected the Vatican Council's teachings on everything from ecumenism to religious liberty to the role of collegiality among bishops. And to give you just one example, their view on ecumenism is that it shouldn't be subject to dialogue. Christian unity will happen when non-Catholics convert to the Catholic Church. And that's been their position all along. It hasn't changed.
Which it's probably worth saying that the Vatican, the Catholic Church, no longer sees ecumenism that way. There's much more talk about like a sharing of gifts, what we can learn from one another.
Oh, of course. It's gone in a completely different direction. Now, it's interesting, when it was founded, the SSPX actually had Vatican approval on an experimental basis. But then Lefebvre began questioning the validity of Vatican II and the reforms. His criticism grew more severe. And at that point, Paul VI ordered the society to disband. Pope Paul VI, of course, was the Pope who really presided over the initial implementation of the Second Vatican Council. he ordered the society to disband. They refused. So he repressed the society in 1975. And the year after that, Lefebvre was suspended from priestly ministry. And it's interesting that that same year, he and the Pope Paul VI, had a meeting which was described as very heated. The Pope actually accused the Archbishop of fomenting a rebellion, so things had escalated. But the Archbishop pretty much ignored those sanctions. He went on ordaining priests and growing the membership of the society.
Yes, and the other big thing that Lefebvre objected to was the interreligious dialogue, the dialogue with the other religions.
Yeah, I imagine if you're not a fan of Christian dialogue, you certainly aren't of dialogue with other religions.
And of course, this became a bigger issue after the 1986 meeting in Assisi, organized by Sant'Egidio in the Council for Interreligious Dialogue, which brought together the other religions of the world in Assisi and started what was called the Spirit of Assisi. And in fact, right now, the successor to Lefebvre, Father David Pagliarini, has been criticizing very strongly what Francis did in Abu Dhabi with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar when they signed that document and the statement that in God's plan, the other religions too have a place. And so I think John is absolutely correct. It's not a question of liturgy. It's a question of various teachings of the Second Vatican Council that the priestly society of Pius X have not been able to accept or digest. I think it's worth also saying what the dimensions are. Today, that society, that's 2026, they have 600,000 members and 700 priests, and they have currently 2 bishops.
Mm-hmm. And these are stats provided by the society, we should say.
By the society, yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned there, that it's about so much more than just liturgy, right? The liturgy becomes kind of a flashpoint for this. It seems at the beginning that it was maybe the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of kind of inspiring Lefebvre to start the society in 1970. So when we get to 1988, this is the year that Lefebvre infamously ordains 4 bishops without Vatican approval, leading to the automatic excommunication of both himself and those 4 bishops. But John, I think that the story behind this, of how the Vatican tried to intervene and stop this, tells us a lot and kind of lays out the pattern for Vatican SSPX dialogue. So tell us the backstory there.
Right. Well, behind the scenes in 1988, of course, both Pope John Paul II and Archbishop Lefebvre were taking their positions very publicly. There were warnings from the Vatican. There was a rebuttal from the SSPX. And meanwhile, the deadline, the date for ordaining bishops was approaching. Pope John Paul asked Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict, to try and work out an agreement with Lefebvre behind the scenes. And in my view, the society at that time was offered a pretty good deal. They would be made a religious order with a degree of autonomy. They would be given permission to use the Tridentine Mass.
That's the pre-Vatican II Mass.
Exactly. And the Vatican would approve an ordination of 1 bishop. In return, the society was asked to promise fidelity to the Church and the Pope, to accept the validity of the new Mass, and engage in what the Vatican called a non-polemical study of Vatican II reforms. Lefebvre actually signed the protocol in Ratzinger's presence. They thought they had a deal.
He took the deal.
Yeah, it was supposed to go to the Pope the next day for final approval. And then Lefebvre went back to his people. He slept on it. He actually didn't sleep well. He told his aides that he smelled a trap. And he basically called up the Vatican and said, "I'm out. I'm reneging on the agreement. That's it. Of course, Pope John Paul II took it personally, and the Vatican immediately announced that if he goes ahead, there will be excommunications. He did go ahead. He ordained 4 new bishops, and the next day the Vatican announced the excommunication of all of them. It's interesting, that was on July 1st, 1988. Have you noticed the date that they have proposed for ordaining new bishops? It's July 1st, 2026.
Oh, wow.
You know, these little provocations are part of the game that's being played.
So they took the deal, they reneged on it, as you said. And then sometime around then, the Vatican forms this official body. It's called the Ecclesia Dei Commission, for basically having ongoing dialogue with the SSPX with a view to reintegrating them into the church, is my understanding of it. So it seems like, despite these kind of public rebuttals of one another, there's still an effort by the Vatican to continue this dialogue and to continue trying to bring these folks back into communion with Rome.
That's right. Pope John Paul II, as I say, he did not want this on his record. The idea of, if you want to call it a schism, there's a debate over that word too, but it's definitely a rupture in the communion of the church. And the Pope wanted to heal it. So he set up this organization that would keep dialogue moving. And of course, the dialogue didn't really go anywhere until Pope Benedict came along. And that's when a whole different kind of approach occurred, because Pope Benedict had his own agenda, one of which was liturgical. He himself felt that the abruptness with which the new Mass was introduced was a mistake, and he thought there had been liturgical abuses. So he was somewhat sympathetic to the SSPX on the liturgy issue.
And when you talk about liturgical abuses, I feel like this is a term that is common in like trad spaces on the internet, but maybe is not so common to folks just in the pews on Sundays. I mean, some of the things that often get cited as liturgical abuses are like kind of insane lack of reverence at Mass, right? So one thing that people bring up is like a clown Mass where the priest was dressed as a clown, something like that, or
right.
the cheese head Mass, right?
The cheese head Mass.
Cardinal Dulle back in Wisconsin put a cheese hat on for a second, which was just part of a joke in a homily, but they saw
but
this
still
as
it was
a
mentioned by
abuse.
the society's leaders as an example. And I think for Pope Benedict, these abuses, he would never really specify which particular things, but I think for him it was the idea that the priest had turned into an entertainer on the altar. He objected to that. He felt there should be just a more reverential approach to the liturgy. And so in 2007, he widened the possible use of the old rite, the Tridentine rite, to include any group of Catholics that wanted it could ask for it. And he told the bishops, if they asked for it, granted. And this was a major shift.
Yes, because he effectively reduced the bishops' authority, if you wish, over the pastoral authority in the local diocese. And this became a bone of real contention within the church.
Well, I think it's important for us to draw a distinction here, right? Because at this time, the SSPX had almost a monopoly on the celebration of the pre-Vatican II Latin Mass, right? John Paul gave some other groups permission to do this. I think Benedict may have given some more groups permission before Summorum Pontificum, which is this document we're talking about in 2007, which allowed anyone to have these celebrations without getting permission from their bishop at first. But, I think that gesture, we need to clarify how exactly it relates to the SSPX story that we're telling, right? Because SSPX, yes, wanted this measure. I think they had even asked Benedict for it. But by widening this permission, Benedict sort of takes some of the power away from SSPX by allowing any other group to also have these
That's
masses.
very true. He neutralized the issue. And in fact, even at that time, there were some members of the SSPX who said, well, we don't want this. Well, we don't want non-traditionalist priests celebrating the Tridentine Mass. And now that was not the position of the leadership of the SSPX. They professed to welcome the change and hope it leads to other things. He was doing two things. He was building a bridge to the SSPX because, okay, you asked for it, here it is. But the other thing he was doing was more subtle. I think he was reaching out to Catholics outside the SSPX who perhaps never were completely comfortable with the new Mass. And he was saying, here, you can have this too. You don't have to join a rebel traditionalist group in order to celebrate this liturgy. And I think it was an effective strategy because it essentially removed one of the key issues that the SSPX had been pushing for all those years.
Well, and if you remove the liturgy issue, then you just go back to having the main issues being these ones that we talked about that deal primarily with the legitimacy of Vatican II or with accepting Vatican II's teachings on ecumenism, other religions.
The core issue has always been the rejection of the Second Vatican Council. And when you remove all the other things, the Tridentine Mass, even the excommunications of the four bishops who done by Pope John Paul II, that was removed by Pope Benedict in 2009. So that kind of cleared the area, but in a way it put the focus on what the real problem is, which is the society is never going to accept the idea that they have to explicitly accept the teachings of Vatican II. Their idea was that give us some kind of legal status in the church and we'll get a foothold, and from there we'll evangelize on behalf of tradition. And essentially, none of the popes who have dealt with this would ever accept that.
John, you mentioned there a really important moment, so I want to make sure we underscore that for the listeners, that in 2009, Benedict lifted the excommunications from those four SSPX bishops who Lefebvre had ordained. Lefebvre was dead by this point. His excommunication couldn't be lifted. And this was meant to start kind of a new era of negotiations on the canonical status of SSPX, which remains in kind of a gray area. So we'll talk about this more later with Francis's reforms, but essentially they were meant to be reintegrated and it just never quite happened. And in 2012, to go ahead a little bit, we see another effort by the Vatican to reintegrate the group that then gets rejected, right?
It's the same offer, essentially, that's been made time and again. Whether it's called a protocol or a preamble or a statement of fidelity, the Vatican has always, in the end, asked the SSPX to subscribe to the teachings of the Second Vatican Council. And that's where they stop. That's where they back off and refuse to do that. So, yes, in 2012, the Vatican actually offered to make the SSPX a personal prelature. That would have been a major development because personal prelature in the Catholic Church does have a great degree of autonomy.
This is the kind of level that Opus Dei was at, right?
Opus Dei is a personal prelature, right? And it seems to have worked for them. I'm not sure it ever would have worked for the SSPX had they accepted. But along with that, in order to get the personal prelature, Bishop Bernard Fillet, who was one of the four bishops ordained in 1988, the youngest of the four, he was now the head of the SSPX. He was told, sign a doctrinal preamble, and this will make it clear you adhere to essential church teachings. And at that point, Fillet thought, what does that exactly mean? I better consult with my members, and by members, priest members, he went back to his priests, heard a host of objections, and came back and said, no, thanks. So once again, a dead end. Pope Benedict really made every effort to reach an agreement with the SSPX. And when he lifted the excommunications of the 4 SSPX bishops, frankly, a lot of people in the church were upset. First, because it seemed too big a concession, and second, because one of the bishops who had been excommunicated turned out to be a Holocaust denier, which had been known to people at the Vatican, but no one thought to tell the Pope before he announced that.
Yes, you have a very pithy line in your book where you say this led to the first papal apology for not using Google.
Pope Benedict actually said in a letter or a statement that he wrote afterward, he said it taught him a lesson that information available on the internet should perhaps be consulted more closely.
My goodness, we have come a long way. But yeah, this had very serious consequences in interreligious dialogue with Catholics and Jews, right? People were very upset about this. This did a lot of damage. So, not a trivial issue.
No, it was not. It caused a storm of controversy. That's a cliche, but in this case, an apt one. And later, I was very interested to see that Pope Benedict wrote about this. I forget if it was in a book or an interview, but he talked about how much it hurt him to be criticized at that moment, because he felt that he was being unfairly criticized, that he felt that, especially from Jewish groups and Catholic groups, who felt simply that he must have known about this and acted anyway. And in fact, the simple fact was Benedict never knew. He was isolated. His aides knew, and the people who should have known never told him.
Mm-hmm. All right. So to go back to kind of the general SSPX story here, there's a pattern that emerges, and I think you mentioned this a little bit, John, that time and again, the Vatican offers various concessions, olive branches, or at least gestures that are seen this way by the public, all in an effort to reintegrate the group. And time and again, the SSPX stops short or even reneges on making agreements to subscribe to the teachings of Vatican II. So that's the pattern over and over again. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about how Pope Francis handled the relationship with the SSPX, and then move on to today and how Pope Leo may handle it. Stay with us. Welcome back. Just before the break, we had talked about a 2012 offer under Pope Benedict that the Vatican made to the SSPX to have them sign a doctrinal preamble, an agreement that they could have signed to reintegrate themselves into the church, which SSPX then declined. Jerry, I want to turn to you now to kind of pick up on the history under the Francis pontificate. So 2013, Francis is elected. The status of SSPX remains unresolved after they refused to sign this doctrinal preamble in 2012. Under Francis, the Vatican kind of continues to offer olive branches to SSPX in some ways, right?
Yes, he authorized the priests in the priestly society of St. Pius X to be able to hear confessions, give absolution, and such like.
This is part of the Year of Mercy in 2015, when there were all kinds of kind of rules made a little bit.
A kind of a temporary thing, and then it became permanent.
Yes.
I think under Francis as well, I think the Ecclesia Dei wound down, if you wish to put it that way.
Yeah, in 2019, the Ecclesia Dei Commission was suppressed and integrated into the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which, as I was researching this, the way that SSPX talks about this is that it was kind of a closing of their dialogue, because it was a closing of this body that was tasked with, facilitating the reconciliation, if there were to be one. And then, of course, we get to 2021 when Pope Francis limits first the Latin Mass celebrations in St. Peter's Basilica to one chapel, and then he places limits across the entire church on the Latin Mass. So basically restoring the decision-making to the local bishops. And that's in Traditionis Custodes. And so, that's not specifically an SSPX issue. It deals with the liturgy, which, as we've talked about, is just part of it. But it's worth mentioning here as part of this story. And that brings us to today, Pope Leo. So we saw Pope Leo at the beginning of his papacy in the fall allow Cardinal Burke to celebrate a traditional Latin Mass for a pilgrimage group in the main area of St. Peter's. That's kind of the only clue we've had so far on what he might do on liturgy. But it brings us up to last week's announcement by SSPX that they would again be ordaining bishops without papal approval. And they say this is a necessary move so that their priests can continue ministering to the Catholics who attend SSPX masses, but it would, of course, also lead to the automatic excommunication of the bishops. Now, Cardinal Fernandez, the head of the Vatican's doctrine office, has set up a meeting with the head of the SSPX that's to be held on February 12th, so actually before our listeners hear this. Looking at this historical context that we've just discussed, my question for both of you is, what is the biggest question that's facing Pope Leo as he enters into this dialogue, as he enters into deciding what to do in response to this escalation?
I would say for Pope Leo, one of the biggest questions is, how much does this matter to the global church? And how much energy and resources should he devote to this question? And I say that because I have heard that during the recent consistory that the question of the use of the Tridentine Mass had been raised as a potential agenda item, but was then dropped, basically because the cardinals decided, let's prioritize here, and this is not one of the priorities. And it's occurred to me that Pope Leo may feel the same way. Keep in mind that back in the 1980s, when Pope John Paul II was dealing with this, most of the Catholics in the world had been raised with the old Mass, the pre-Vatican II rituals and the pre-Vatican II teachings. So there was, I think, a natural sympathy among many older Catholics in particular toward what the SSPX was preaching. That's no longer true. But the vast majority of Catholics alive today were born after Vatican II. And Pope Leo himself bridges both, but he was, 10 years old when Vatican II ended. I don't think it has the same impact for him than it did for John Paul II. And so what I'm thinking is, what if Leo chooses not to play this out in public the way John Paul II did, and Benedict to some extent, with warnings, public warnings, you're going to be excommunicated, don't dare do this, and then the public debate. And it tends to build up in the mind of the media, certainly, and among the world's Catholics, the idea that there is a crisis occurring. What if Pope Leo simply says, you know the punishment, and he doesn't go further than that?
I think that's quite an interesting analysis, John, and I would subscribe to much of it. Remember that Father David Pagliarini, the present head of the SSPX, he asked for an audience with Leo last August, and he wasn't given it. And then he wrote a letter afterwards, kind of outlining his position. And on the other hand, what you've got is there is a study group on liturgy set up under the Synod, which Leo is pushing forward. And at the consistory, which you mentioned, Leo said, well, we're not going to forget the liturgy question. That will be dealt with. Really, the bookends of the consistory were Francis's Evangelia Gaudium as the start point and the Synod as the end point of what they classified as priorities. So I think it may well be that Leo will downplay this. And as you say, I mean, we've 56 years of discussion on this, and there has been no indication, none, that the priestly society of St. Pius X, anyway indicated that they're prepared to buy into all the teachings of Vatican II. That is a constant. And I think Leo will be well aware of that. And also, Father Pagliorini will meet with Duccio Fernandez, the Cardinal, head of the Doctrine of the Faith, on this Thursday, the day before people will listen into this. And remember, at the consistory, Duccio spoke about the implementation of the Second Vatican Council and underlined the importance of the Second Vatican Council. So there's no flexibility at that side. I mean, the Second Vatican Council is part of the Church. And if you want to defend tradition, that is part of the tradition of the Church now. And so you reduce tradition in the society's understanding by excluding that.
I want to ask y'all about the role you see this kind of gesture, threat, we could say, whether you see this as an effort to force the Vatican to the negotiating table on the canonical status of SSPX, which, as we've said, remains unresolved, or if this is primarily about their urgent need for bishops.
I think they're trying to test Leo, first of all. I really think this is, they want to see how Leo reacts. You have at the other side the proponents of the Latin Mass pushing, and these are coming in on this angle. I don't think Leo is for turning when it comes to the Second Vatican Council. I think he's made that very clear from his first speech to the cardinals to his latest statements to the consistory. The Vatican Council is there, and it's not for being sidetracked.
I think the SSPX does want to ordain new bishops, but it's not a crisis moment for them because, in 1988, Archbishop Lefebvre was 82 years old and one bishop. They still have two left, and they're approaching the age of 70. So, there's probably time to work things out if they actually want to work things out. I think they're using this threat of ordination as for leverage to precisely to convince Pope Leo that they ought to be given some kind of canonical status in the Church. That's what they want. And they still believe that as long as they get that, then they can do their work from the inside rather than from the outside. And by their work, I mean, in their view, preserving and protecting tradition from the reforms that stem from Vatican II.
I want to end on this concern for souls question, because it interests me as I've gone back and read these various statements and documents while I was researching for this episode, that both the Vatican and SSPX are using that justification of concern for souls. I think you already mentioned that, for the SSPX, it is a little bit moot in that, the folks who are going to those masses are able to go to even non-SSPX Latin masses. At the same time, the Vatican is really concerned for these folks. We talked a little earlier, and I think it wasn't very clear about the kind of gray area that they're in. But I guess to put it succinctly, is the Vatican concerned here about schism, about the people who follow SSPX, being further isolated from Rome?
I think the Vatican probably does have a concern about what happens if there's a definitive break, again, excommunication followed by a rupture in talks, I think they are concerned about whatever the number is, if it's 600,000 followers and 600 or so priests of the SSPX. Sure, the Vatican's concerned. But as time goes on, I think concern has shifted more toward the fact that the SSPX really wants to continue to undo some of the reforms that were introduced over the last 50 years. And that's the red line for the Vatican. And I don't think any pope is going to concede on that.
Yes, Leo has made very clear one of his goals is the unity in the church. But, to have unity, you also need the other partner to be willing to move. And we have not seen in 55 years a move in relation to their approach, understanding, willingness to buy into, accept the teachings of the Second Vatican Council. I think that is the bottom line.
I think I see this slightly differently from y'all. I think, Leo's concern for unity has been manifest in an unwillingness to do anything that would maybe foment division. And so it seemed to me like he might want to continue down this Vatican line that we've seen over the decades of, making some concessions in order to prevent this sort of schism or definitive break. So for me, I thought that the key question would be, how much is he willing to give to prevent that schism? But it could be that the answer is not that much. So it'll be interesting to see how Pope Leo chooses to kind of continue this ongoing dialogue, discussion with SSPX, and we'll see what his next steps are. Obviously, we'll be covering all of that here on Inside the Vatican, but in the meantime, John, thank you so much for joining us, and I want to recommend your book, The Vatican Diaries, to our listeners one more time, because it includes that great chapter on exactly this issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colleen and Jerry. Good to talk to you.
Great work, John. Thank you for your input. It's very good.
And Jerry, thank you so much for joining me once again on the show. It was so great to have you back. So I look forward to many more episodes with you now that you're feeling better.
Thank you, Colleen. Very happy to be back, and greetings to all our listeners.
If our listeners want to check out more about this story, I will link to John's book in the show notes, as well as all of our ongoing coverage. Also, check out our Latin Mass deep dive that dug into Traditionis Custodes, the Pope Francis' decision on restricting it, and how that affected communities across the church. And an update for our listeners from that February 12th meeting between the SSPX Superior and Cardinal Fernandez. A Vatican press release described the meeting as cordial and sincere. In it, Cardinal Fernandez and Father Pagliarani discussed certain points the SSPX had made in various letters from 2017 to 2019, including, quote, the question of divine will regarding the plurality of religions. Cardinal Fernandez proposed a continuing theological dialogue on some unresolved topics, including various Vatican II documents, that would have, quote, a well-defined methodology, and it would be aimed at highlighting the minimum requirements necessary for full communion with the Catholic Church. It would ultimately outline an official canonical status for SSPX. The press release also says that the Holy See maintains its position that if the group goes forward with ordaining new bishops without papal permission, it will be considered a decisive rupture of ecclesial communion, and here the release adds schism in parentheses, with grave consequences for the fraternity as a whole. Father Pagliarani hasn't yet responded on whether he's going to pursue that dialogue. Inside the Vatican is a production of America Media. This week's episode was produced by Kevin Christopher Robles, who is also our audio engineer. Our executive producer is Sebastian Gomes. You can find up-to-date Vatican news and subscribe at americamagazine.org. For America Media with Gerard O'Connell, I'm Colleen Dulle. We'll see you next time.